One night, a young woman named Iris, unable to sleep, heads to the kitchen, grabs a pocket knife, gets into her car and drives away from home. She travels a long way along a forest path, occasionally looking at a toy boat she brought with her. Finally, she reaches a secluded park and reaches a cliff. Iris climbs one of the cliffs and approaches a small memorial erected in memory of a child who died in this place. She cries over his picture and then walks towards the edge of the cliff. It becomes clear that Iris has decided to end her life and musters the courage to take a step into the void. Suddenly, a man appears nearby, sits down next to her and introduces himself as Richard. He begins to ask her about the tragedy, explaining that he came here to be alone and wants her to listen to him. Richard tells her that he used to have a car and a beloved girlfriend, Chloe, but one day he crashed the car, crashing it into a brick wall. The worst part was that they had a fight right before Chloe died. Iris involuntarily begins to listen to him and even offers words of sympathy, to which Richard only frowns, saying that everyone around him said the same thing. After the accident, he was paralyzed for about 3 months, living with the help of machines and all his visitors pestering him with their sympathy. After listening to him, Iris suddenly shared that her husband had carved their names on a tree, while their son was looking for sticks to roast marshmallows. Meanwhile, she was picking flowers and hadn't seen their son fall from a height. Now she no longer understood how to live. It was as if she was broken. Richard suddenly says that being broken doesn't mean hopelessness, stands up, and prepares to leave. Unexpectedly, Iris realizes that she no longer wants to jump and follows him all the way to the cars they left at the entrance to the park. But when she tries to get into her car, it turns out that Richard had parked his car too close, blocking her from getting in. Only then, as if realizing it himself, he walks around her car and suddenly hits her with a stun gun. She regains consciousness, tied up in the back seat of Richard's car. Panic takes over her, and when he hears her rapid breathing, Richard realizes that she is awake. Iris attempts to call for help using her watch, but he tells her that there is no signal in this remote area. She has no hope of her husband finding her quickly either. Richard mocks her attempts to convince him to release her and places her son's toy boat, which he took from her car, in front of her. This reminds Iris of her pocket knife. She carefully pulls it from her back pocket, opens it, and begins to cut her restraints. In order to prevent Richard from hearing her, she starts a conversation about his family, but he turns the subject to her dead son, forcing her to continue talking. Richard is not fooled, however, and states his intention to take her to his cabin in the woods, where he plans to braid her hair. But when she frees herself, Iris crushes these dreams with a stab wound. The blow only scratches his body, and Richard loses control of the car, unharmed, and it crashes into a tree and hits his head. He tries to restrain Iris, but she fights back, and eventually they exit the car on opposite sides. Iris cuts the ropes on her feet, jumps, and tries to look for help, but the path is deserted. Richard stands up too, regretting that she ruined such a perfect opportunity. Everything was going according to plan. Isolation, no witnesses, an empty road. But he foolishly didn't check her pockets, and now he's paying the price. Oddly enough, he notes that she wanted to end her life anyway, and by the way, she should already be feeling the first symptoms. With those words, Richard shows her an empty syringe. He explains that he's taken the necessary precautions and injected her with something that will soon make it impossible for her to move or speak. Her body will no longer serve her, giving him complete control. In 20 minutes, she'll lose fine motor control in her hands. Then she won't be able to hold a knife or walk, so she might as well go with him. Richard extends his hand invitingly, but Iris runs into the woods. She loses her knife, but she still manages to run, though her fingers are becoming less responsive. She checks her watch to keep track of the time, remembers her counting exercises with her son, and realizes that her dexterity is deteriorating. Richard's voice calls out as he catches up with her. Iris keeps running, but her body grows increasingly numb. Eventually, she realizes that she will soon be unable to move. She crawls along the riverbed and finds a cavity under the roots of a tree, hiding inside. At that moment, she hears Richard calling her mockingly as he searches for her. When he seems to have lost her, Iris realizes that she is lying on an anthill. The insects crawl over her face and she can't stand it, so she rolls out of the cavity. Richard hears her screams and returns to the river, but she rushes towards the water and throws herself into the river, which sweeps her away. Richard sees this and screams that she won't be able to swim, but somehow she stays afloat, eventually reaching the shore, where her body loses all movement. She lies in a meadow, realizing that she can no longer do anything. Suddenly, she spots a building nearby. Soon, an older but strong man approaches her on a lawnmower. He examines her, realizes that her eyes are alert, and immediately realizes that she can communicate by blinking. Once for yes, twice for no. Iris indicates that she is not injured but needs help. The man goes to get a wheelbarrow, and as she lies down on the grass, Iris suddenly notices the beauty around her. Sun, clear sky with a faint plain trail, greenery, peace. When he returns, the man takes her to his cabin to ask for help, but doesn't get the chance when someone knocks on the door. The old man turns to the entrance, noticing Iris blinking madly. He opens the door to find Richard outside, looking desperate and begging for help, finding his wife, who he says has been injured in an accident. The man asks him to wait outside, intending to get the phone, but Richard enters despite his pleas. Richard complains of feeling sick and asks to sit on the couch, but he also scans the room, noticing the wheelbarrow but not finding Iris. The old man again asks him to leave and wait outside, promising to help but on his terms. Richard claims he lost his phone in the accident, so the man offers to bring his phone outside for him. He plans to tell the rescuers that someone broke into his house. At this, Richard breaks down, and the man, feeling pity, asks what really happened. Richard claims his wife is mentally ill, that he is protecting her as best he can, and that he fears she will be institutionalized if the police find her this time. He says he loves her very much and blames himself for letting her drive, which she so desperately wanted. However, he is said to have lost his temper due to one of her maneuvers, causing her to lose control and fall. He faints, and when he regains consciousness, she is gone. He fears that she has become dazed and unable to move or speak. As Richard talks about his love, the man glances at Iris lying under the sofa, unsure of who is truly in danger. Seeing Richard's desperate expression, the man remembers his wife, who often nagged him about her health at the expense of her own, and eventually ignored her own symptoms and left him alone. He decides to tell the truth, even admitting that he was not entirely honest. But then Richard's phone rings, revealing his deception. The man once again asks him to leave. Richard drops his pretense, asking why the man's cart is in the kitchen. The old man admits that he did indeed find a woman and hide her in his shed, and asks them to leave, promising to forget the incident. Richard heads towards the shed and first snatches the man's phone. The old man pretends to comply, but then pushes him away. Richard falls and a cabinet falls on him, allowing the old man to grab his phone and call emergency services. Richard attacks him, and they struggle, eventually old man winning. Richard finds a knife though and stabs him. Iris watches the old man helplessly die. Meanwhile, Richard retrieves a can of gasoline from the shed and begins to put out the furniture. At that moment, Iris manages to tap the ground. Richard sets the house on fire and gets out as Iris reaches for the curtain wire. Now sitting in the old man's truck, Richard notices the curtains moving and realizes where Iris is hiding. He pulls her out of the burning house and puts her in the front seat of the truck. As they drive away, he berates her for forcing him to kill the old man. He has never killed a man before. Suddenly, his phone rings. He puts it on speaker, and Iris hears his daughter's voice, announcing that she and her mother are coming to the cabin in the mountains because he has been away so much, and they miss him. Richard feigns excitement and asks them to bring everything for the outing, though Iris notices how angry he is, causing an accident with an oncoming bus. Later, Richard realizes that their car is low on gas, and they need to stop at a gas station. Nearby, an ambulance speeds by, smoke billowing over the hill where the old man's house has burned down. Richard puts a hat on Iris's head and goes to pay for gas. Iris tries to signal for help, but her body doesn't fully cooperate. However, she manages to unbuckle her seatbelt, turns to the window, and drops the hat from her head. Suddenly, a child's face appears through the window, staring intently at her. Before Iris can make any noticeable gesture, Richard reappears, and the boy's mother arrives, sensing that something is wrong, but unable to pinpoint what. She takes the boy away but glances at Iris several times. Richard gets back into the car, presses the gas pedal, and they soon arrive at the original accident site, where his damaged car still stands. Richard changes into new clothes and begins to repair his car. Meanwhile, Iris's fingers slowly begin to regain movement. She shows them off, just as a highway patrol car pulls up nearby. A worried woman calls from the gas station, describing a car that matches Richard's license plate. Richard tries to ignore the officer's questions, but the officer is clearly suspicious. The officer notices a strange truck in front of Richard's bruised face and becomes increasingly wary. At that moment, Iris manages to crack the window slightly, prompting the officer to take a closer look. Richard attempts to pass Iris off as his wife, a woman deeply affected by the loss of their child, who is now struggling with alcoholism. He uses her son's real name and tells the true story of the boy's death, causing Iris to cry. Seeing her distress, The officer is almost convinced by Richard's story, but Iris manages to whisper and help, and the sight of plastic bandages and a filled syringe in the truck convinces the officer that something illegal is going on. Richard reaches for his gun, but Richard first strikes him, hitting him with a metal chain, then beating him to death. He then loads the officer's body into his patrol car and sets it on fire. Richard then drives away from the scene, blaming Iris for the officer's death, claiming that it was all her fault. Now able to speak, Iris responds by saying that his mental state is to blame. She recalls his story about the hospital and suggests that his mind was shattered at the time. Richard stops the car and explains that when he saw his girlfriend's broken neck, he gained a sense of clarity and realized his purpose. He thanks her death for giving him this mission from God. Iris reminds him of his family, noting how much he loved them, and explains that this must end. She suggests that he let her go. She knows nothing of his true identity or background, meaning that he will not be caught, but Richard changes course, taking her to a nearby lake. Richard stops at the shore, and Iris manages to grab a syringe, even jabbing him in the leg, but lacks the strength to push the plunger. Richard laughs at her weakened state, and Iris suddenly remembers that she wanted to die earlier that morning. He grabs a knife, places it in a rowboat, and gets in, rowing to the middle of the lake. Iris realizes that the end is near and begins to cry and asks Richard to retrieve her son's toy boat from her pocket. As he does so, she grabs his knife and stabs him in the neck. He pulls out the knife and reaches for a gun, but she pushes it into the sea. Richard struggles back to the boat, but Iris grabs the gun and shoots him, causing him to disappear underwater. Iris collapses exhausted on the bottom of the boat, watching blood stain the surface of the water. Suddenly, the boat begins to fill with water from bullet holes in its sides. She is pulled into the depths, still tied up. The toy boat her son had cherished floats peacefully on the surface of the lake, just as Iris appears on the shore, exhausted and alive. After catching her breath, she notices Richard, still alive, lying nearby. She approaches him and surprisingly thanks her possible killer. That was the whole story. Thanks for watching.